this long to get you on the podcast, but better late than never. And I'm so stoked to talk to you.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me here. I've been a big fan of the podcast ever since it started, and it's an honor to come on.
Awesome. So I know you've talked about this on podcasts in the past, but I feel like the recent stuff you've done has been with Green Pill, just really sharing your knowledge, and you haven't really talked about your background in a while. And I think you have one of the most fascinating backgrounds out there. So you actually went to school and studied environmental studies, and then you spent a good number of years doing work in Tanzania, and that is sort of how you got into public goods funding and just funding in general. And now, obviously, you do a lot of work with on chain public goods funding, on chain data, all that good stuff. But could you just quickly give us the TLDR of your really unique and interesting background before we dive into all the stuff that you're doing today?
Yeah, so I definitely do kind of view my background as being different than most people that I encounter in the space. I just actually wrote an essay the other day about what, like, my first job out of college was working on a USAID funded project in Tanzania. And USAID is like in the news a lot right now because it's getting shut down effectively. And so I kind of saw, like, working abroad, you kind of see a perspective of what it takes to do business and what it takes to organize people and get things done, which is pretty different than if your only experiences are like here in the US or kind of growing up in like a fully developed country. And so coming right out of college, the first like practical work experience I got was literally trying to organize groups of people, set up businesses, kind of work with money, move it across borders and so on. And it was so difficult. Like in East Africa, I was there for a total of 10 years. I was never able to open a bank account. There were many times when I would literally go to a bank, take the local currency, convert it to US dollars, take a bus, 3 hours across the border, and then do the same thing just to change money and use that to like set up a business or pay people. And at the same time, like you saw that there was also this like tremendous potential to leapfrog things. So in East Africa, they never really had a landline network. Immediately they went straight to mobile. And when I was working there, I had everybody that I was working with had a mobile phone. No one had a landline. And you quickly saw that if there's a technology which is 100 times better than like literally no communication, not being able to speak to people if they're geographically separated, then it can very, very quickly leapfrog. And so kind of being there when like the Bitcoin white paper came out and when the first kind of signs of a, like the Ethereum community coming together, it was kind of obvious like how important this technology was. At the time, I was not in a position to do very much because I was running other projects and I was like involved in my own startups. So it wasn't really until like 2020, 21 when like DAOs had a resurgence and that became another thing where I was like, oh, like this just kind of like took over all of my thought space on the nights and weekends. And I found myself just wanting to read more and more. And then eventually that kind of turned into me like contributing to a couple DAOs and collaborating more and more with like groups like Gitcoin. And then eventually I was running a Web2 startup at the time. I kind of exited out of that and decided to go full time. And yeah, I've been in crypto ever since.
That's an awesome story. And I just want to make sure we don't glaze over the leapfrogging part of this because we've been talking to JJ and Keeks from Parable recently. They were pretty involved with the stuff that we were working on at DevCon. And JJ especially talks a ton about leapfrogging. But for anybody who hasn't heard that term before, isn't really familiar with it, can you just explain? I mean, you sort of explain, it's literally when countries, nations, regions skip over sort of that like natural progression of technology that we would think, goes from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. But can you talk a little bit more about that and just what the ramifications of that are?
Yeah. So maybe a better analogy would be like if you're here in the US, where I think both of us are, you have things like Venmo, you have Apple Pay, you have the ability to go to an ATM and like in some cases take out money without having any fee. So you have like a pretty sophisticated banking infrastructure. And I'm just like listing a few of the many options that you have. If you're in like Tanzania, Ethiopia, Vietnam, other parts of the world that don't have that kind of robust banking infrastructure, if you want to do those types of things, it's oftentimes much more difficult. And then if you want to do it with someone who is not like literally in your country or that you have some kind of established commercial relationship with, it can be almost impossible. And so because we are used to a system which is like kind of good enough, it's very difficult for normal people to see the value in having stable coins or having peer-to-peer payments. And if you're in a place where you've never had that before, it's so obvious how useful this is. And so like leapfrogging basically means that instead of having to build up all of the intermediate steps that we've had to build up here in the US or in Europe in terms of like a banking system and having all of the services like Venmo and stuff like that, you can just immediately go to the future technology and it'll be adopted much more quickly.
Gotcha. And so we've seen regions like Tanzania. Like, when was the last time that you were there? When did you come back? Or do you know what their current state of just like money movement and things like that currently stands?
Yeah, so I'm not like a deep expert on this stuff right now. I spent like a total of 10 years in East Africa. Most of that was at the time when like mobile phones were taking off and things like mobile payments were like becoming a thing. So like I can't really comment on the state of crypto adoption right now, from personal experience, but from reports that I've read, places like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa have had much higher like rates of adoption and uptake and developer interest than other parts of the world. And it's obvious why, because like the current system is so bad. We've always said like the first killer use case for crypto is payments, and it's obvious in places that don't have that infrastructure how important this is. And it just enables so much more once you have that kind of basic infrastructure to happen. So again, like being there, it was just obvious that these things should exist and provided a better option than every country kind of developing its own infrastructure to do all these things that we take for granted in the US.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate here, being from the US in a sense, because it's hard to understand how obvious and important this technology that we're working on can be for people. And to step out of this, like, I feel like in the US, it's just like casinos and gambling. Like, that's what people know crypto as. And it's really hard to get people to understand that this is so much more than that. There's like huge implications of this that we just won't feel living in the US probably, but that people from all over the rest of the world may feel. So that's really cool that you got to see that and experience that firsthand.
Yeah, totally. I think that getting a chance to like see how other parts of the world operate and kind of living in a different culture for a period of time just kind of changes your expectations. Like you tend to take certain things for granted if you've only known one place, and then you see completely different systems, in many cases very successful, just operate a different way. Opens your mind to there being more than one way, like more than one right way of accomplishing something.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also curious too, where your interest in data came from. Do you have a background in that as well from the Web 2 world, or how did you get really interested and involved in data? Because what you're working on now, Open Source Observer, is all about sort of like analyzing, parsing through data to create better governance systems and things of that nature.
Yeah. So I come from a family of people that were always like very into math, and like one of the rebellious things I did was actually go off to Africa and do things that were not like math or quantitative initially. The reality though is that I kind of always found myself in a situation where there'd be some kind of multidisciplinary team that would be trying to do something, and I would end up being like the data guy that would come in and say, oh, like maybe we can do this and layer it together, and then we can have an answer, a dashboard or something. So I tended just to gravitate towards these kind of data problems. I think what has always been like a unique interest of mine is trying to connect different data sets. So like when I was first in Tanzania, what I was doing was talking to farmers, getting soil samples and looking at satellite imagery and layering those things on top of each other. These days with Open Source Observer, we look at on-chain activity, we look at GitHub activity, we look at grants programs. And so we take data sets that are public and anybody could go and analyze one thing. We kind of layer them together and through that hopefully create like much deeper insights.
Yeah, that makes sense. You can still hear me, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, my mic just glitched out. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so tell me about sort of some of the work that you've done since getting into the Web3 space, since joining Gitcoin, getting involved in governance. Like, where have you been able to connect the dots between data, governance, social impact, and how have you seen that evolve over the time since you got into it in this space, and then also comparing it to public goods funding in the traditional space?
Yeah, so I think that for me, the part that like first got me interested, let's just take Gitcoin's work. So they have this mechanism called quadratic funding. the basic insight is that we should fund things in a way where it's not just a popularity contest, where you are actually able to identify things that appeal to like a diverse coalition of people, as opposed to the ones that just have the most money, or maybe just the most individual voters. And so they kind of took this idea that kind of existed in the world of theory, and they built a mechanism and a protocol that allowed you to do things that way. And then they built a whole community that was kind of interested in like using this and doing successive rounds and experiments every quarter. And so that kind of like funding experiment was very interesting to me, because right now there's very little innovation happening on governance, on funding mechanisms in the legacy world. But here's an example where you can just go in, you can literally create your own currency, you can start deploying it in different ways, and you can see what happens. So that kind of idea was like super, super fascinating. In the legacy world, you just don't see that happening at all very much. It's like very, very difficult to get funding for these types of things, and it tends to get captured. And so here was like a space that I observed where people were doing this like rapidly. And I think that the other part that got me very excited about the space is that being able to fund these kind of things, being able to create sustainable funding for a network of different public goods or teams or growth initiatives, however you want to categorize it, was like the most important thing for many of these ecosystems to get right. It wasn't as if they just had like a core team and maybe they would take 5% and give that back to other teams that they thought were doing useful stuff. It was actually the most important thing was to figure out how do we create utility for our token, for our economy, by bootstrapping activity. And so that means that we need to fund very specific types of initiatives. We need to be thoughtful about, if they're early stage, how much we put into, these kind of newer projects versus ones that are more mature and getting that kind of balance right. And ultimately trying to create something which is going to be much more effective as a network than as like a single corporation doing everything itself. And because that was like the most important thing for them to get right, it meant that you would get like the best mechanism designers, the best thinkers trying to work on that problem. It wasn't something that was just like, relegated to the corporate social responsibility department. It was like, top priority for everyone in governance.
Do you think that there were things that you took and you could learn from the traditional public goods funding world that you brought into your work with Gitcoin or just like Web3 public goods funding in general? Or do you think it was really like there wasn't any precedent for how things can operate effectively because, like you were saying, in the traditional world, things are so centralized, they get captured so easily. These are all things that we're trying to fix in the Web3 world. And so it's almost like every round of Gitcoin grants that you run or optimism grants or whatever, you're experimenting with something new in order to learn something new and build out that playbook.
Yeah, so there's a number of things that we should definitely like learn from traditional grant making and stuff like that. So on the one hand, like the amounts of money are just bigger, right? It's like very significant. And if you were to add up all of the amount of funding that's flowing through the Ethereum ecosystem to public goods or to open source teams, it's in the hundreds of millions, maybe $1 billion, and that's like not even the size of a nation state. So it's still very, very small. But I think what is interesting about it is, number one, these structures are robust. They are, immutable smart contracts. They are able to send funding permissionlessly to teams of people all over the world. And you can make the incentive structures programmatic and auditable and verifiable for anyone. So you kind of have that capability, and at the same time, we're at a point in history when trust in public institutions is so low, right? And there's obviously a voice we should just tear it all down. But then what do we kind of build, and what like fills that gap? Because there's still going to be things that we want to fund, still things that we don't want to do individually that we want, to put collective resources towards. And so I just think that there's so much, number one, experimentation, and number two, useful lessons that are going to come out of the space that hopefully can just transform the way that public goods funding is done more generally. But like today, the amount of funding is tiny. The amount of wastage, although it's different, there's a lot of incentive programs that are just like not effective and haven't had very good results. We can all point to those examples. But at the same time, the rate of learning is so fast. There's so much experimentation happening that I'm pretty confident we're going to find a handful of mechanisms that are really robust and they can be exported from crypto to the rest of the world.
Can you give some examples, just kind of diving in on that data piece, of how you've been able to use data or learnings that you've had about what types of data or what metrics are most important in evaluating whether a project should be funded, and then also evaluating on the back end too, like, was this actually impactful? Like, should we fund this type of project again, or was this a mistake and we should learn from it and fund something else in the future?
Yeah, so we're still very much in like the search phase here. I don't think that we can say that there's one metric or one approach that's going to work for any use case. Like one thing that we've definitely seen is that layers of context is much more impactful than just having one magic metric. So we definitely try to find things that give us patterns or allow you to make comparisons with similar projects. That kind of context layer is super important. As I said before, being able to combine and layer multiple data sets allows you to define cohorts and to surface much more kind of meaningful trends than just saying, here's one indicator, let me apply this blindly to every single project. A lot of like the insight is going to come from trends and things that happen over time. So, big drops in engagement, churn, dependencies that become super popular. Those are all like signs that something is gathering momentum. And I think that like depending upon how you're funding things, there's a role that data can play in all of that. So if you're just kind of doing due diligence on projects, it's pretty easy, hopefully, to see which ones are like already very popular and which ones are a bit scammy. When it comes to kind of trying to go deeper than something that might just be, we have this issue of like things being popularity contests. So being able to find metrics or signs that are like deeper than superficial signs that a product is popular, still very difficult. I think that here's where we need to do a better job getting kind of reputation and qualitative input from people that really know a domain or have a subjective experience with something, and finding a way to surface that in the right way. A problem that comes up a lot is the notion of Goodhart's law, which is that once you identify a metric and deploy funding against it, then everybody's going to start gaming it, and it's going to become a target. So the solution is that you just have to keep evolving your metrics intelligently over time until you find some that are kind of robust to that level of gaming. But again, going back, we're still very much in like the search phase here. I don't think that there's any like one strategy or one metric that I could recommend. If anything, everybody needs to kind of do the research of calibrating their metrics to the things that they want to see growth in.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember Kevin Iwaki talking about Goodhart's Law too when he came on at MCon back in the fall and did a quick little episode with us. But I'm curious too how you balance the qualitative with the quantitative metrics and data. Like you were saying, you started talking about like using reputation for that qualitative piece, but I'm just thinking, coming from the creator world, there's a lot of big impacts that creators can make for projects, but a lot of that is hard to measure in your traditional way as compared to, for example, a dev who's building out an app. You can measure it by number of users of the app or just a lot more clear-cut numbers. With something like creators talking about a project, making videos for a project, I think that's a lot harder to measure. So how would you balance the qualitative piece with the quantitative? And also, like, what strategies or experiments have you run to find the best metrics for that qualitative piece that have worked?
I don't have a good answer for this yet. I don't want to diminish the importance of it. I think that actually, taking an example of all the podcasts I've listened to, I could probably single out here like the 5 or 10 that have been the most impactful for me. And in many cases, like the impact is like huge orders of magnitude. I definitely remember as like a random example, one that really stuck with me. I think it was around the time like Mirror was launching, and there was an interview on like Chase Chapman's podcast with Rafa the Builder, and I was like, wow, like this just completely changed the way that I think about so many things. And it was such an impactful episode. And I don't know if that was because like the interview, if you were to give that to like 50 people, that would all hit them the same way, or it was just that it hit me at a certain point in my life when I was looking for it and was just very, very impactful in that way. So I have no idea. I think that, I'm never going to say that I'm a quantitative maxi when it comes to these types of things. I think we do need to find that balance of, surfacing the right information and being able to use that alongside more, quantitative or traditional metrics. It's a massive search space. We need kind of more people that are trying to work on it. That's what I think we're trying to do with Open Source Observer, is make it so that you can connect different public data sets, and then you have a variety of people that are trying to connect them and add value and generate their own insights. But like right now, I think that it's definitely like one of the pillars which needs to be elevated. We need more qualitative metrics.
Yeah. Can you think of any good examples of grants programs that use data and metrics in a really effective and empowering way? Or any examples of grants programs that kind of tanked because they didn't do it the right way? Like it could be like it doesn't have to be like a whole program that like did something right. It could even just be like a tiny piece, just so we can get some examples of good applications and uses of metrics and data, and also like not so effective ways.
Yeah, so I won't single out any programs that have been like particularly ineffective, although you can probably dig them up on Twitter somewhere. I think that we've done a lot of work with optimism and retrofunding specifically. The concept is like a very obvious one, which is that if you look back over time, it should be easy to pick out the projects that were most impactful and identify them. And if you create like a real incentive to reward those projects, then that should motivate them to do the things in expectation of getting retrofunding. That's like the idea. But in practice, it's also still very, very difficult because number one, people think that they're actually good at this. And you might be good at like looking at a set of 5 things, but once you scale that to 100 or to 500, it's just super, super difficult. Again, like using the podcast example, if you gave me a list of all the podcasts I've listened to, I could probably pick like my 3 or 4 favorite ones. But once you're getting me to rank like, number 67 versus number 68, that becomes incredibly difficult. So I think like the idea of this is very powerful, that you can identify winners and you can reward them after the fact in a way that justifies the upfront cost. But we're still like at a point right now where we need to get much better at like the curation, so that when humans are actually making these decisions, they're able to, leverage data and apply their own insight in an effective way. And right now, I personally don't believe that is going in and doing all of these like little bitty comparisons of every single project. I think you need to really quickly say, okay, it looks like this is what you care about. Now let's zoom in on this part of the distribution and say, okay, well, what do you think about this? So that's some of the work that we're doing right now. Curation is very subjective. So I might say that I care about growth, and you might say that you care about retention. And we can have different ways of measuring those two things and different algorithms that might like curate a different set of projects. What we're experimenting with Optimism right now is actually trying to do that curation for the voters and say, here's one list that emphasizes growth, and here's one list that emphasizes something else, and so on. Pick the one that you think resonates most with your values. And that's very different than what used to be the process, where they would actually go in, every person would express their own preferences, and then you'd basically average it out. We'll see if it works. It's coming soon, pretty untested, but an exciting experiment nonetheless.
Yeah, I was going to ask about sort of the process of designing these systems too. Obviously, you don't want it to be centralized. You don't want it to be one person acting as dictator and deciding what all the metrics are going to be and how we're going to go about it. But at the same time, you to fully decentralize it and ask for input at every stage can also just be a really slow process.
Right.
And you're just not getting money out like as quickly as possible to these projects that are waiting for it. So I was going to ask too, like about the process and how you've found the right balance of making sure we're getting input from the group and it's just not just one person capturing the process versus like, let's also kind of speed it along and not just sit around the table and discuss this ad nauseum for months and months and months.
Yeah, we're definitely still iterating on it right now. At Open Source Observer, everything we do is in the open, so we build completely in public. So anybody can kind of come in and see the data sets that we're compiling, how we're building models on top of them. And then ultimately, the algorithms that we propose are not, what we think are best. It's like a couple different options, and then the community is going to decide what they think is best. And the way they're structuring it is that instead of there just being one vote, there's going to be 6 smaller votes, and then every month, basically, things update based on the votes from the previous one. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity for this to evolve. I'm optimistic that there's going to be like a pretty fast learning loop, and once people start seeing all of this data and all of this ways of like ranking projects, that people are going to come out of the woodwork and say, oh, I have a better idea for how to improve this algorithm, or I have a new idea for how to, surface something completely different or something qualitative. I'm hoping that will happen. Oftentimes you just have to get something going. You have to do like solve the 0 to 1 problem and get something out there, and then people kind of want to contribute. I do definitely. I'm always amazed by when you build in public the amount of kind of serendipity and unlikely things that happen when people observe that and have ideas and want to contribute. So again, we're trying to be good role models in that way, but also hoping that once this kind of gets going, it will nerd snipe other people to come in and add value.
Yeah, for sure. How long, by the way, have you been working on Open Source Observer, and like what stage is it at?
So we're like a year and a half in at this point. Ray and I, the other co-founder, we met at Protocol Labs. We were kind of working on a project called Hypercerts, which is trying to create impact certificates. A lot of people have talked about there being markets for impact. But like, in order for these markets to function, you need some measurement function. You need some way of determining what was more impactful than something else, so that the market can be like informed when it goes in and purchases these claims. So we said, okay, like first order, we should just solve that. And as we kept trying to like work on it, we became more and more fascinated with the problem itself. And so eventually that led us to spin out and focus on that full time.
Gotcha. Talking about voting too, because the voting process, I think, is also a lot more complicated than people think, and there's a lot more that goes into it. Just from the perspective of like human psychology and how humans like to behave and act. I remember having HTML Tina on the I don't even know if it was Rehash or a previous podcast I was running like years and years ago, and she was talking about just like designing the voting page, like the governance page, and this was, I think, pre-joke race and really like more robust voting tools that we have today. But she was saying how like even the order in which you rank the projects, like if you have 100 submissions for funding for this grants round, the order in which it's ranked, like people, the judges are going to maybe scroll through the first 10, the first 20, and then glaze over the rest, and so the rest don't get as much attention. So that's why I was really bullish when Joke Race launched their like randomization feature, where now when you go and vote for Rehash Guest, for example, you see like the people with the most votes, but otherwise it's all shuffled every time. If you click refresh, it's all shuffled. Your name might appear at the top one time, you hit refresh, now it's at the bottom, now it's in the middle. So I think that is obviously something that we've learned over time, but have there been other things that you've learned? Like I know specifically that you, in one of your articles on your blog, which by the way, I'm going to link your blog in the show notes here because there's so much good stuff on there. And I was just like going down such a deep rabbit hole on all the things that you've written in the past. I don't know how you managed to crank out so much content and like quality content too, but props to you for that. But one thing I remember reading is about how you noticed that game mechanics affected distribution patterns from the retro PGF. I think one of the Optimism retro PGF rounds. So I was just curious to ask, like, what have you learned about human behavior and incentives that maybe has like surprised you and you weren't expecting?
Yeah. So thank you, first of all. I really appreciate your kind of going through the blog, and that was one of the pieces that's really near and dear to my heart because. You kind of take, again, like a simple idea, like, okay, we can just vote on which products we think are more impactful. And you kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of actually doing that. And all these things, like you said, like what order do things come in? And, I can maybe look at 10 projects, but once I get to 30, I'm going to get worse at it. And if I get to 100, I'm probably just going to give up and start spraying and praying and, not giving it thought. And, you could do a whole bunch of experiments and say, okay, if you get the product first, do you rank it differently than when you see it 50th? And you probably do. But the point is that as much as we think this is going to be governed by math, the reality is that it's much more very traditional human things, like, what was the order that they saw things in? And, what was the font of this, of this project compared to the one that came before it and so on. And humans are just so bad at these things. And we know it, right? There's a whole bunch of behavioral psychology research that kind of looks at this thing specifically. And if we're trying to design like robust incentive programs, then we have to be like aware that these game dynamics are going to have a pretty big impact on how people play and the results that you see. Again, I don't like have an answer for how to change human psychology, but I don't want to I don't want to undervalue the importance of like good UX and proper design and making sure that you actually getting people to do things that they are good at. So people are not like the original proposition for retro funding is you have a list of 100 projects and you have a pile of tokens. Figure out exactly how much how many tokens should you give to each project. That is such a hard task for anyone to do. And when you approach the problem that way, everybody's going to come up with their own solution for how to do that. Some might make a spreadsheet. Some might just divide it and give everyone the same amount, etc. You can make all sorts of examples. So coming up with the right balance of, say, getting people to make a few very, very important choices and comparisons early on, and then from there, guiding them through the rest, and then giving them, say, a chance to override or veto the final allocation, that might be a much better flow. What we're experimenting with right now is something very different. One thing that we've learned is that people in the abstract, it's very difficult to say, I prefer this metric or like this domain more than another one. But once they actually see some projects and see the ranking, they will have like a very visceral reaction, like this is not fair, or yeah, actually that's pretty good. And so what we're trying to do is actually get those kind of reactions from people, high level. Do you like this funding? Do you think this one is better than that one? And see if that leads to a better result. But it's definitely an evolution. And what I really value about the way Optimism has approached this, which you don't see as much in the public sector and like the traditional legacy way of funding, is that even when things go wrong, they still continue. They put it out there and say, yep, like this is what happened, this is what we learned, and we're going to actually improve on it, as opposed to trying to sweep it under the carpet and not talk about it and then move on to the next one immediately.
Yeah, I think the reflecting back on it is a very important part of the process. One thing that I found surprising in myself, the last time I was asked to sort of like judge a bunch of projects that came through a grants round, I think I was given maybe 10 or 20 projects on an Excel sheet with links out to all their applications, and then there were maybe 5 to 10 criteria that I was grading them on a scale of 1 to 10, something like that. And one thing I noticed was the first time that I saw a project in a certain category, one of the criteria was how innovative is this? And so the first time I saw it, I was like, wow, this is so innovative. And then by the time I got to the third project that's building essentially the same thing, I found myself ranking it like not innovative at all. And it's literally the same. These projects are doing the same thing, like they're just as innovative. It's just because of the order in which I was going down the list and the order that I hit that particular project. That was one thing that I noticed. Another thing is there were a few projects that I started reading and I was like, I just don't get it. Like, I don't get how this would be impactful. Like, I just don't get why people would want this. And then I would get to down the list and I get to the third project that's building the same thing. And I'm like, maybe I'm the dummy then. Like, clearly people want this if everybody's building it. And so I start to second guess myself as like the judge or the grader of this grants round. And so even like just going through 10 or 20 applications myself, I noticed, these like weird things in my own psychology that I was like, I feel like I'm messing this up. Because like I'm picking up that I'm doing these things, that I'm noticing these patterns just in myself. Like, I wonder if anybody else is experiencing this, or like if they're sending the same list to 5 other graders, or if they're shuffling the list every time they send it, or how they're doing it in the back end. Because I started picking up on all these like things that I was like, I feel like this is creating errors in the results. Just from one person. Yeah.
It's so exhausting. Like, you must have probably felt like mentally taxed after going through that process.
Yeah, I just kept second guessing myself, and I was like freaking myself out after, like, more and more so as I went through like more and more applications. And I'm not somebody that like overthinks or second guesses by nature, but I just felt the pressure of like, we're handing out this much money, it's going to create a lot of impact. I want to get it right.
Yeah, like I think we just need to accept that there's some things that humans are like good at and that you can will have very good intuition for. and some things that are just really difficult for them to do. And like one example of something that's just like very difficult to do, and I think you hit upon it, is compare two things that are like very different domains. Like how do you compare, I don't know, a wallet provider with a DeFi protocol? Like
Right.
okay, both might be great, but if you were to compare them side by side, it's very difficult. And so even just like setting up the right comparisons and figuring out how you order them can make a pretty huge difference. I mean, part of what I kind of wrestle with is obviously, you know, there's ways that data and like AI agents and things can help make these decisions easier and like lubricate it for us. But on the other hand, you know, we're at this point in time when we are just so kind of skeptical of how other people are making these choices. We can look at the outcome of, say, how a government agency or how a company has decided to do things, and we have very like visceral reactions to that. And oftentimes, what I feel is kind of missing is some kind of layer of, you know, statistics or data that people can check themselves. At the very least, to have a bit more confidence that the people who were doing their job had the right information when they're making decisions. I think it's like one thing to say, okay, you had this and you decided the wrong way. It's another thing if you just like didn't, you know, bother to look up these things in the first place.
Yeah. How do you feel about like open voting versus closed voting? So the example I just gave you, we were all given a spreadsheet. I did all the voting by myself. I didn't talk to anybody else. I have no idea how anybody else voted. I don't even know who the other voters were. That's like system one. And then the other way is sort of using something like joke race, for example, which is what we use for rehash. And obviously, you know, with rehash, it's more just like a fun thing. There's less at stake than handing out 10 grand to a project. But I have also actually run grants rounds in the past. I ran a grants round with Arbitrum a year or two ago where we used joke race and we were experimenting with that. And I think the danger that I saw from that is, say we have this voting period and say we have 50 projects that are competing for this grant, and by, you know, the final 12-hour mark, say like I'm on a ski trip and I can't log on until like the last 5 hours, I can already see which projects are ranked at the top.
Yeah.
So at that point, I think, well, like, why would I cast my votes for the project I want to cast my votes for? They're at the bottom. They're not going to make it anyway. So I might as well just cast them for the people at the top. And obviously, like, people do this in the rehash guest elections as well all the time. You know, it just like it's so what do you think about, like, do you think voting for grants should be open or closed?
I mean, I think it depends on the situation. So I think one of the things that's very good about the way that many like voting interfaces on Web3 projects is that you can see how people are voting, and if you're okay with the result, then fine. You choose not to vote, or you just kind of, you know, go with what everybody else has done, and you're okay with it. But if you're not happy with how things are going, then there's actually a chance, while the voting is still happening, to mobilize and say, actually, I feel really strongly that we're about to make a bad decision. And you try and convince people to change their votes if that's like supported by the interface, or you get the people that haven't voted to change. So that's definitely like very powerful, and there's examples of that. Kind of tying things back to like my early career, we used to do these voting experiments where we would basically get a cooperative of farmers together and say, all of you need to assemble. I could give like more of a setup, but I'll kind of just jump to the conclusion. You know, you're going to be entering this new chapter of your life, and it's going to require new leadership. And so we would basically get all these people together in a field or something, and they would take a vote on their leaders. And we A/B tested what happened when you had an open system where you could just raise your hand and vote for people, and when it was actually a closed ballot system. And the results were dramatically different. When you did a closed ballot election, you got much better results. You got much better leaders. You got leaders that were actually, you know, there for the right reasons versus ones that were like politically connected or like just powerful. Because obviously, you know, reputation matters, and if people can literally see that you didn't vote for your friend, it's going to lead to some difficult conversations. So yeah, there's like definitely some cases where you want it to be closed for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. No, there are definitely learnings from that. And I think we tried to prevent some of like the negative aspects happening by like running an election on who the voting council is going to be and trying to keep that as small as possible and as high quality as possible so that, you know, people wouldn't be as affected. But human psychology, you can't get past it. I'm curious, like looking ahead to the future, Where do you see sort of like these fields of data governance, public goods that you've been working on? Where do you see this going in the future? And say like in 5 years, if everything goes ideally according to plan, where do you hope to see on-chain public goods funding?
Uh, First off, I definitely want things to go from hundreds of millions to billions to eventually trillions of like funding flowing on crypto rails to public goods. That's kind of a loaded term, but I just broadly mean things that don't have a traditional business model, but are like net good for society, however you might define that. Um, I I want us to cross this chasm between like crypto funding crypto to actually crypto funding a whole range of things that are valuable and useful. Again, open source is like a good example of that, just because it's completely borderless and it is growing. Like more and more people are learning how to code and to do software, or just to like use those interfaces like GitHub to do things. Again, that's just an example that I know well, but there's many more, I guess, places that you could see that happen. I want to see more governance experimentation. I want to see things like retro funding be forked and used in different contexts. Things like quadratic funding, be modulated on and tried out in the real world more often. And then other new mechanisms that we haven't thought of yet. One in particular that's pretty cool right now. We're doing a project with Vitalik and VoiceDeck and Drips and Gitcoin and a few of the partners that I'm probably not mentioning right now. Pairwise Pond to basically map out the entire Ethereum dependency tree and figure out how much each edge is kind of worth to the other one, and then basically deploy funding against that. So you can potentially fund thousands of teams in a kind of decentralized way, just based on some way of identifying how much value each node brings to the ones that depend on it. Kind of interesting data problem, and potentially very useful for funding large networks of open source teams, which doesn't require a huge amount of governance. So there's probably like 5 to 10 different like really valuable mechanisms that can be exported from crypto to the rest of the world. I would love to see like this space get a better reputation. I think that right now we're still obviously like not fully out of all the the bad mojo that came out of the 2022 period. But I think that there's just so much idealism and good experimentation that is happening that it would be a shame if no one else in the world kind of saw that. And I think the last thing that I'm like pretty excited about is just the power that comes from having public data sets available and in the hands of more people. I think we've kind of probably hopefully reached like the bottom of certain government or other data sets being kind of walled off or too difficult for people to access, and hopefully now there's a movement to make those more accessible, because I think that builds trust. I think that gives people more options for how they can fact check and how they can verify their sources of information. And then we've seen in many other fields like sports and finance this kind of revolution that happens once you bring these different data sets together. And so I hope that we can see that for public goods and for funding public goods.
Where do you see the biggest gaps being right now with why we aren't at the ideal state that you want us to be?
It's probably like partly a talent or a what people are interested in working on issue right now. I think that typically a lot of the public good space is very vibes driven, and then you have other parts that are just very skills driven, but there isn't like much intersection between the two. So part of it is just kind of like opening up that space and getting more people that have the skill set, but also care about the domain space to apply it there. And on the other hand, people that like want to fund open source software, getting the data skills or getting kind of the right exposure so that they can contribute in a more meaningful way. I hope that we can just like bootstrap that together. That's something that we're working on. I think that we're still at a point where it's just like difficult to connect these different data sets. We're trying to make a platform for anybody to connect a public data set and make it very, very easy for them to derive metrics and do funding and other things on top of that. But it's taken like a year and a half of lots of data engineering work to get to that point where we can even start to do it for a few ecosystems. So hopefully we're about to like turn a corner in making that more accessible, but it's been a long journey. Yeah, I think those are probably like the two main ones.
How can people like myself, for example, who've run grants rounds, participated in grants rounds, or people who've like are founders who have applied to these grants rounds before and have feedback to give or something, how can we contribute? Because like I feel like from this conversation we just had, this was the first time that I said a lot of the things about like my reflections on these programs.
Right.
And I feel like this is like relevant and valuable information for people like you or other people really working in the space to have. But I haven't found a way to really share that information, open source that information, and learn from each other. So what's the best way for people like me to, I don't know, contribute, like get this information and knowledge out to the people who are working on it and who really need to know?
I mean, I think what you're hitting on is that there's like a talent density issue, and so you need to get people that kind of care about this stuff in the right rooms, talking, sharing their ideas. Obviously, right now, coordination is like a challenge that we face. Like, is it Telegram, or is it on Twitter, or is it on like a discourse forum? I think like the form factor might change, but like the important thing is that we're still like at a point where things are small enough that I feel that if you put your work out there, be it through a podcast, be it through just like a long form blog post or something else, then more often than not, it will eventually get discovered. I'm still kind of optimistic that that's how things work in this space, at least, because we're still relatively small. So yeah, I would just do that. I would just like, put it out there, and trust that the curation lords will find it.
Sounds good. I will definitely continue to do that. Finally, we have a couple of questions from the community. This one is from cxy.eth on Twitter. They said, have there been initiatives to make financial contributions to open source projects tax deductible?
Oh, yes. One good one to check out is called Open Collective. So they basically do the like totally unsexy work of coming up with a back office for these open source projects so that they can pay taxes and do payroll and like handle certain expenses. And in some cases that means like giving you a nonprofit where you can work under it, and they take I think it's like a 5 or 10% fee for that service, and then the rest goes to the organization. So that's
nice.
one option. Yeah, so check that out.
Awesome. I had no idea about that, but that's really cool. And then the other question is ski maps.
Oh yeah. So I told you that I like layering different data sources.
Yep.
One of the first things I was really into, I was like always a mediocre skier, but I loved ski maps. And I loved like, there was like a particular artist, James Newhouse, who would make like 80% of the ski maps around the world.
Yeah.
And so I would basically take a map of a resort that I knew and just, make my own version of it and say, like here's an area. What if you cut this part of the mountain open and put some trails down here? And so I would like make my own versions of ski maps. That kind of culminated in when I was in high school. I did like actually know some coding and stuff like that, and so I had this whole program where I created my own ski resort simulator. There's like this game called Roller Coaster Tycoon. This was like the same thing, but for making a ski resort. And you could basically start with a mountain. You could put the lifts in. You could carve, all the trails however you wanted.
That's awesome.
If they're going to be groomed or not and stuff like that. So I was like obsessed with that aspect of like the ski industry.
That's awesome. Do you still do any of that?
I mean, I still look at ski maps. I still like obsessively when I'm going someplace, we'll try and like work out like the slope of every trail and kind of figure out is it like a double fall line or single fall line, like what would the snow conditioning be like, but I don't actually make my own maps now.
Do you do any backcountry skiing?
A little bit. I want to do more of it.
Okay, yeah, because
are you into that?
Yeah, I do. I do, and that's why I was like what you're talking about is like I'm not like a map person, but it's highly valuable to like going in the backcountry. Like it's like for me, it's like a necessary part of this activity I like to do. Like this is the part I don't enjoy doing, but I know it's like necessary to keep alive, doing the things I want to do.
I would never want the pressure of like my map being what is going to keep you alive. That sounds scary, but I think it's super important that people do that. And
yeah, or I wonder if do you take like commissions? Like if I have like a favorite backcountry route, could I commission you to draw me a cool map of it so I can hang it on my wall?
I don't think I'm a particularly good drawer of these maps. Like it's actually very difficult to get the shading right, so you can see how steep something is. there's this book that like describes all of the techniques that this artist used to get things just right. Um, I'll send you my pictures. They're pretty comical, but there's like only 5 people in the world that do this. It's like a very,
Yeah,
very
it's super niche.
super niche.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. That was an unexpected part of this conversation, but I love it. We'll have to chat more about that.
Totally, yeah. One thing in Denver, there's going to be a couple like get-togethers of people that care about funding public goods. There'll be Shelling Point,
Yep.
kind of an annual thing at ETH Denver. There's going to be a event that Allo Capital is putting on. So they're having a launch. They're trying to get more people interested in using their mechanisms for funding public goods. There'll probably be a few others.
Yeah, I am looking forward to Shelling Point. It's going to be my first one, but Rehash is actually, I've been talking to the team. We're planning on hosting a show there, something fun. Nice. So I'm really excited about that.
Cool.
But I'll be there either way, and excited to see you and see the rest of the team and all of our friends there, and maybe do a little bit of skiing. We'll see what happens, how the conditions are, if we can go do a little backcountry tour or not. I like to bring I don't know if you have any animals, but I like to bring my dog with me.
Ooh, wow. Okay.
Backcountry skiing, so that's always a good time.
Where do you keep your dog when you're skiing? Like a backpack or?
No, he runs next to me. He hikes it and he runs.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, he's a beast. I'll send you a video after this. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Carl. Thank you so much for taking the time. Tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you personally, and also where they can go to learn more about Open Source Observer and create their own, map out their own data, get into all of that good stuff.
Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter. It's Carl_Cervone. I have a website. It's like my last name, serve.one. You can see some of my writing there. And then if you want to check out Open Source Observer, go to opensource.observer.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And we'll be back again next week with another episode of Rehash.